Hi, I'm Hannah Fraser, and I'm joining you from Melbourne, Australia, to tell you a bit about questionable research practices, replication studies, and how these relate to teaching in ecology. It's nighttime in Australia at the moment, so I'm pre-recording this, but I'm going to be online to answer questions on Slack as well, so please feel free to drop me a line. Starting off with questionable research practices. A little while ago, researchers in psychology identified a number of practices that are associated with low replication rates. So if you repeat a study that had been conducted originally with some of these practices, you're less likely to find the same result as they did. Now, I wanted to ask ecologists about whether they engage in these practices as well, because we currently don't have a very strong idea about how reliable the ecology literature is. So if you repeated any given study in ecology, how likely you would be to find the same result. So I asked ecologists and evolutionary biologists whether they'd engaged in each of these practices at least once, and the same questions were asked in education and in psychology. So we've got a nice cross-disciplinary comparison here. And the main takeaway I want you to get from this table is that across all of these different questionable research practices, the rates are very similar between fields. So if these practices are driving a problem with replication in psychology, they're probably also driving a problem with replication in education, in ecology, in evolutionary biology. There are a number of practices up here, but I'm going to zoom in on cherry picking today because I think that's one of the big ones for ecology and evolution, and one that we can really have a meaningful impact on through teaching. Cherry picking is selectively reporting the parts of the study that showed statistically significant or otherwise noteworthy results, and hiding those sections that seem boring or didn't turn out the way you'd hoped they would. It's questionable because it increases the false positive rate. Say I conducted one study and I'm using a p-value hypothesis test. It's got a 5% chance of finding a statistically significant result, even if there is not a true ecological signal. If I then conduct another 50 tests, that increases the chances that I will find at least one statistically significant result. And if then I hide all of the tests I did that didn't find statistically significant results, it is making my research look more certain than warranted and increases the false positive rate in the literature. So when we're looking at how many ecologists and evolutionary biologists said that they'd engaged in these three practices at least once, so that's omitting non-significant studies or variables, omitting non-significant covariates, and omitting analyses. So that's when you do analysis and then it doesn't turn out how you want. So you do a completely different analysis and only report the second one. So we're ranging from about 43% to 65-ish%. And that's quite a lot, I think, but it seems like an underestimate to me because lots of us are collecting data that looks like this. This is some stuff that I collected during my master's. So I was looking at the relationship between woodland bird occurrence and vegetation structure and components in Victorian woodlands. So I was collecting all of these variables, and you can see that these are the vegetation variables I was collecting at the site, and there's 30 on this sheet, plus all of the bird species, and there's 112 of those, which I could select representative species from or combine together into an index in multiple different ways. Plus, I can transform a lot of these variables in different ways. I might want to log transform some. I might want to not log transform things that should be log transformed. And then I could also get almost unlimited number of environmental variables from the web that might also have explanatory power over this. So there's so much that I could do. And before I collected this data, I didn't have a very clear idea of how I wanted to analyze it. So I tried to do it in a whole lot of different ways, ended up reporting the things that work the best. And I have a feeling that this is a lot of how ecology works. When there's so much freedom over what you can do, you do a whole lot of things and then you can't really report them all. And you end up in a world where you're cherry picking. But you didn't really set out to do that to start with. It's just sort of inadvertently part of the research flow that you have come to expect to do. So some teaching solutions for this might be to incorporate pre-registration into teaching for undergraduates. You could do this by having two-phase assignments, where in the first phase, you get them to pre-register a data collection and analysis plan. So that's just writing out an analysis and data collection plan in detail before you have access to the data or before you go out to collect the data. You could mark that, and then you could get them to submit a final report and look at how differently things turned out than they pre-registered and how those two documents relate to each other as part of your marking. When we're talking about graduate students, you could insist on a solid research and analysis plan prior to data collection, or if your student is working with pre-existing data, prior to them accessing the data. And you would need to assist with this because it's tricky, particularly for students, to work out how analysis should go without seeing the data. So they would need a bit more hand-holding than usual, I think, with this step. Then ideally, you would get them to pre-register this plan, maybe publicly on a place like the OSF, or they could just pre-register it with you. And you could keep this in a safe place and timestamp it so that you know to check back on it when they're finishing up their thesis or the paper that's arising from their work, so that you can ensure that they include and discuss the original plan in the paper, even if it doesn't turn out as it's planned. I'm not saying that that's the only thing they're allowed to do, but I am saying that it's best if in this kind of workflow, you do still present the original plan that you had gone out to do, even if it didn't pan out, and then also alongside it present the other analyses you do, just being clear about which part was the original plan and which part was added on as exploratory work. Moving on to replication studies. I'm not going to dwell too much about this because you're probably all over it already, but I've just compiled the replication rates across different disciplines. These are from large-scale replication projects. And you can see that depending on the field, we're ranging from a 6% replication rate, so repeating the study in exactly the same context will get the same result 6% of the time. That's in genetics, and then 78% in experimental philosophy. So it's a super large range, and we're not sure where ecology fits into this because there haven't been any systematic large-scale replication projects conducted in ecology yet. Clint Kelly has done a little bit of work in this space, so he's looking at how many studies that exist in the literature are replication studies outside of this idea of doing a large-scale replication project. So he found that 0.023% of studies in ecology identify themselves as replications, and that when you look through studies in depth and go to try and classify them as replications or not replications by hand, you see the results below. So when we're talking direct or exact replications, that's sort of what was shown in that previous table, things where you repeat the study as closely as possible to the original, and he didn't find any of these essentially. When we're talking about conceptual replication, that's when you take different elements of the study and tweak them a little bit, and it can tell you a little bit about direct reliability of the result and a little bit about generalizability. We're looking at about 25 to 35% of studies that Clint looked at qualified as conceptual replications. And then we've got quasi-replication. So this is when you take a similar idea or approach from one species and translate it into another species. And the remainder of studies got allocated into this category. The thing is here that obviously it's hard to do a direct replication in ecology and evolution because so much is changing. Even if you did something in the same location, it would be different potentially in another year, which makes it really hard. The thing about direct replications is that you can identify much more clearly what's causing a difference between the original and the replication study. You know that it's to do with sampling error, QRPs, or fraud, or mistakes, I should say, and fraud. The more things you change from the original study, the less sure you can be that it's driven by, that any difference is driven by those things and not driven by whatever thing you've changed. So the fact that 25-ish% of studies are conceptual replications is actually quite a complicated category, which might be different in more or less ways from the original. It's tricky to get a direct replication, but I think that it is much more achievable to be able to get replications that are closer up towards this top of this table, where a lot of the things are kept very similar and only altered in ways that shouldn't be expected to be different from the original study. So in terms of a teaching solution to try and get at this problem that there aren't very many replications in ecology, so we don't know how reliable studies are, I should say, and also at the same time provide useful teaching outcomes, there is a project in psychology called the Collaborative Replications and Education Project. And their goal is to conduct replication studies as part of the undergraduate syllabus. It's tricky, again, with ecology when we're talking about direct replications because, as I said, they're difficult to repeat exactly, and also most studies have a massive scope. much longer data collection times, and the logistics just aren't compatible with conducting studies as part of an undergraduate degree. But what might be possible is doing replications with pre-existing data. So finding some data from a study that was collected in a similar way, in a similar context, that you could reanalyze using the methods from the study you're interested in. So, for example, if I had a study on the effects of runoff on coral bleaching in the Great Barrier Reef, I might find another study that looked at coral bleaching in a different runoff on coral bleaching in a different part of the world, and see if applying the protocols from the original article, the analysis protocols, would find a similar result. And that's the kind of thing that I think would be really achievable in an undergraduate, and it could be really good for teaching about the need for thorough reporting, because invariably when you start looking at any of these articles in detail, you find that a lot of the details you need to actually redo the study are missing. It can tell you about critically evaluating study design, and it can potentially produce a publication that could be really helpful towards these budding researchers' careers. So that's all I've got for you today. And I'd like to give some special thanks to Tim Parker for sharing his thoughts on open science teaching for me. And any questions?